All right, Church and History, High School, ninth and 10th. We are in chapter 14. And unlike the last chapter, which covered centuries and centuries of the monastic movement, here we're focusing on less than a decade. And yet it's a very decisive one, as the title of the chapter, The Church Makes Efforts to Free Itself. One of the things you've talked about a lot in this class is the relationship of church and state. Um, and really, what we're talking about a lot in the Western Church is the papacy. We're talking about is the church going to be able to choose its own leaders, or is it something going to be imposed from the outside by the state? It's somewhat analogous to, you look at some of the kings of Israel, and they instituted their own priesthood. And of course, those would have been a lot of yes men who would have supported the northern king breaking away from the southern kingdom, from the line of David. Or, um, there's other examples we could speak about. Um, but part of this is, is the church leadership going to be able to be untethered to the state so that it can speak to the state and prophetically call the state to obey God's will? This seems like it's just a Catholic problem, but in fact, John Calvin was very, very concerned in Geneva to do the same thing, to make sure that the church could choose its own leaders, choose its own elders and pastors, so that they wouldn't be beholden and that they would be able to speak prophetically to the to the culture. So anyway, this is kind of an interesting time period. We're in the middle of the 11th century. But first, we're going to go back and talk about how the papacy develops, just kind of a review. So we're talking about stages in the Roman Church. So we're going back and covering what's happened through the first 1,000 years, the early importance in the Roman Church, and there were various reasons for this. Primarily, we're talking about the fact that it's the capital of the empire, right? And so just as people are going to be focused on it politically and culturally, so that's going to cause people to think about the church in Rome. But another reason is just ecclesiastically, Peter supposedly died there, and there's a tomb there that's actually, where they think Peter is buried. And so that's another reason why it gained such prominence. And, from your world history class, this leads to the Petrine theory that supposedly Peter appoints a successor, and then you've got this succession of bishops there in Rome, which becomes the papacy. Again, the role in the ecumenical councils, the fact that Rome was always right on questions of orthodoxy, and particularly the Tome of Leo that was prominent at the Council of Chalcedon, is very important for the rising prominence of Rome. So the second stage leads to the rise of the papacy. And again, you'll remember figures like Leo, who I think is also called Leo the Great, Leo the First, Gregory the Great, Gregory the First. And not only was there a Benedictine rule that's written between Leo and Gregory, but there's also a rule of Gregory, which was a book that was written by Gregory to kind of tell pastors how to shepherd their flock. And so that's another reason why he becomes important in this period. However, all institutions tend to decline, and the papacy is certainly, even though they're supposed to be the vicar of Christ, they don't always represent Christ very well. And of course, some would say they never represented Christ well because they weren't supposed to have that much power and that much authority over other Christians. So John the 10th, if you want to look him up, he was a pretty bad dude in the middle of the 10th century. But then beginning of the beginning of the 10th century, we have this Cluny revival, which again is focused on one abbey in southeast France, but it ends up becoming very influential across Christendom, across Western Europe, and um, there's a lot of good things about it. Now, the Cluny reformers, they want a faithful pope, and they wanted reform. And so there's reform happening throughout the church. It's happening amongst clergy and monks, but it's also happening among laity. And one of those laity is William of Aquitaine, and he's the one who gives his favorite hunting ground to these monks to be able to start this abbey. Um, and so again, we don't want to view the medieval church wholly in a negative light. I think hopefully this book is helping you understand that even though there were lots of problems, um, it was still a Christian territory as opposed to, the paganism and other religions you see in the Islamic countries in the Middle East and North Africa, or the Eastern countries like China and India. However, you did have a lot of problems, and this guy was guilty of simony on behalf of himself, his own office, there in the papacy. And so you've got this conflict. So the reformers are appealing to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry III. And again, we're talking about a period, maybe a century after the founding of the Holy Roman Empire under Otto I. He was influenced by the Cluny renewal, and so he wanted to do right. He wanted to do what would promote best the interest of the church. So eventually you have these three popes, all of whom get ejected: Sylvester III, Gregory VI, and Benedict IX. And as a result, we have the first non-Italian popes being installed here. And we have Clement II. He did not live long, and this leads to Leo the Ninth. Obviously, when there's kind of similar names being used, the numbers can count up quite quickly. One of the recent popes was Benedict the 16th. So you had Benedict the Ninth back in the 10th century. There were several other Benedicts. I think he was the first Benedict, though, for about 500 years. And he also, interestingly, was a German, like Henry and Leo the Ninth. So Pope Leo is a consequential figure here. He was a leading supporter of the Cluny renewal, and so he wants to bring positive change, positive development. He realizes that there have been serious problems in this office, and he wants to represent the spiritual interests. The one thing he does is he appoints these College of Cardinals, and this was for the purpose of trying to stop this lay investiture. These cardinals had been around before, but he kind of cleared house and set up a new cabinet, sort of like, when a new president comes in, is going to happen in our country here. Usually the entire old cabinet goes away. Sometimes they'll keep one as kind of a token gesture to the other party. I'd be surprised if Biden does that here in this situation, just because of how controversial the Trump presidency has been in this transition. But anyway, so Leo was clearing house and setting up a new one because of this ongoing corruption, because of, you would assume that the previous cardinals, if there was such a poor pope, as represented by these other guys, that they were not very interested in godliness. So anyway, that's what Leo does, and so he's seeking to use this new College of Cardinals to kind of deal with this lay investiture problem, so that the church can, again, as the chapter title says, make efforts to free itself, to not be dependent on the nobility and those in positions of political power, but those who are hopefully truly spiritual. Again, that was the ideal. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's part of the reason why he sets up this College of Cardinals. There is ongoing reform. So a mobile papacy, he travels to different places, and popes often do that in the current era. They want to kind of, not everybody can make a pilgrimage to Rome, right? So the pope will travel and sort of spread his goodwill and things of that nature. I can't remember the last time a pope visited the United States. I think it was sometime in the last 10 years, sometime in your lifetime. Anyway, when they would go there, they would have various synods and councils and sort of declare these new reforms that they're trying to bring about. So what were some of the reforms? Well, clerical celibacy. One of the things that you're going to see is more and more the secular clerics, right? The guys who lead worship, the priests, the guys who administer the mass, are, because of the success of the monastic movement, this Cluny renewal and other, you're going to see the secular clergy starting to look more and more like the religious orders, like the regular clergy, to be regulated that way. And so they're requiring them now to be celibate. This was not necessarily something that was true in the West during the first millennium, but it becomes increasingly true. And eventually, I think it's the Fourth Lateran Council, in another 150 years, it's actually going to be mandated, you must be. And of course, that's been the rule for the Roman Church ever since. Forbidding simony, again, one of the previous popes had tried to sell his office. And so we're saying you can't buy the office anymore. Now, again, was money still involved? Yeah, probably was in various ways, but at least they were theoretically trying to deal with that problem. Selection of clergy, again, this kind of lay investiture. You're not going to have the noblemen just impose a priest on you, but there's going to be a joint decision of the clergy and the people together. That's always kind of an interesting question: is how does a pastor get, how does a church get a pastor? You've seen in America with our kind of independent streak and the rise of congregationalism, where it's nobody outside the local church; it's just the local church that picks them. Whereas in more churches that look kind of more like the Roman Church, the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, the bishop kind of moves guys around. So anyway, it's an interesting question. And again, the purpose of this was to combat the lay investiture problem that had been going on in the church. Again, sometimes the lay investiture church, like with Henry III, was very necessary to deal with. And that is going to become one of the problems when we get to the Reformation in another 500 years, is that there was no more mechanism to to kind of deal with a corrupt pope. This College of Cardinals didn't really have the power. We are going to see the rise of a conciliar movement to kind of address that. But the papacy becomes more and more independent. There's no way for the secular ruler to deal with a great corruption. So anyway, that is going to be one of the issues that's going to lead to the huge crisis of the Reformation in another 500 years. So one of the things that happens during the reign of Leo the IX is the schism between East and West. We covered that more thoroughly in chapter 12. So even though there was this, this instituting of the Cluniac reforms, it doesn't mean that everything was peachy keen. So there was a conflict with Patriarch Michael Cerularius, excuse me, and that leads to the two parties, first the West excommunicating the East, and then the East responding, rather than repenting or whatever, instead excommunicating the West. And that is, in a sense, still the official position of those two bodies today, that if you're not part of the Eastern Orthodox Church, you're not part of the true church. If you're not part of the Church of Rome, you're not part of the true church. Now, granted, Vatican II back in the 60s, 50 years ago now, well, 50 plus years ago now, softened that a bit. I think it even recognizes Protestants as separated brethren, but you still kind of have to be in fellowship with the Bishop of Rome to be part of the true church. Anyway, so there's been 1,000 years of schism. You can go back over why that happened in chapter 12. So the Cluny reformers face a dilemma here on page 98. So there's another German pope who becomes pope, and Henry III dies, this Holy Roman Emperor who had been so helpful to the popes. And so there's this very young child, only 6 years old, who's going to become Henry IV. And so how do you get support from the Holy Roman Emperor when he's so weak? So again, it's this question of church and state. How does the church relate to the state in terms of how these offices are filled, how they're supported, how they're viewed in the society at large? So they needed the help of the emperor, even though they didn't want the help of the emperor. They need Henry III to maintain the papacy, but Henry is gone. He's died. So they're trying to stave off the local Romans, Italians taking over again. But, they don't have a strong Holy Roman Emperor to help them with that. The infant King Henry IV, Agnes is weak, as you can read here. So they're seeking an opportunity to break free. But, is that really going to happen? Is that really going to help? So this leads us to around 1056 and Pope Stephen X. He is seeking papal independence without imperial dictation or influence. He's chosen by the Roman clergy. Again, neither the Roman emperor or the Italian nobles. And again, this is in order to prevent this notion of lay investiture, which again we've talked about here. We've also talked about in the world history class, which is a desire to weaken the emperor's power as well as the local nobility's power over the papacy. And yet, even with that, Stephen still ends up needing to consult with the regent in Germany, the Queen Mother, if you will, of Henry IV, Agnes. All right, then we move on to Hildebrand. So Benedict X comes in And the Roman nobles, again, are trying to impose their will. There's a child king up in Germany, and so he can't stop them. The clergy in Rome, they don't really have the political power. It's not like they have their own army to stop the local nobility. In fact, this leads the College of Cardinals to have to leave for a time period. And then we have the rise of the next pope. Um, so Leo the Tenth, or the guy who would become Leo the Tenth, had this guy Hildebrand with him, and he's a very important figure, right? You can see the section title: Hildebrand selects the next pope. But that hasn't happened yet, but that's what's going to happen. So Gregory the Sixth banished to Germany, and he is accompanied by this Hildebrand. And then Leo, so Hildebrand discovers, as it were, Leo during this time of exile. So Leo is appointed pope by the Emperor Henry III, and then he takes Hildebrand back with him. And so Hildebrand goes from a place of being exiled with Gregory VI back to a place of central power and becomes the CFO, the chief financial officer for the papacy. And so, he ends up being very important. And so he crafts a plan for who's going to be the next pope. So first of all, he wants someone who's a Clooney supporter, because again, this is a very significant movement that's trying to bring about important change in the life of the church. He secures both the some of the people of Rome, the Duke of Tuscany, and so he gets church and state support. He also seeks the consent of Agnes, again, who is this kind of regent in place of Henry IV. And this leads to the man who becomes Pope Nicholas II. You need to remember that these were not their original names. If you've heard of Muhammad Ali, right? Muhammad Ali was not the name he was born with. He was born with the name Cassius Clay. And then when he embraced what's called Black Islam, he ended up changing his name. Okay, just as like when you used to be when you got confirmed, right? One of those 7 sacraments when you were a teenager and you would profess your faith, you would get like a 4th name. That's why J.R.R. Tolkien, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, when he was confirmed, they added the name Reuel to his name. So anyway, all that to say is that Nicholas was not his original name, just as Hildebrand, he's eventually going to become Pope Gregory VII. So even though there is this guy Nicholas there, the real power lays with Hildebrand. He's the guy who put him in place, and that often happens where you can set up somebody in power, but since you're the one who set them up, you're the one who really holds the power. So he's kind of like the puppet master, and Nicholas is like the puppet. You can see here on pages 100 to 101 a timeline tracing this out, particularly section 1 that we covered in this chapter. So what about Hildebrand? Well, he is born in Italy in 1020. He grows up in the area of Rome. He's educated at St. Mary's Monastery. He is an assistant to Gregory VI, who had bought the papacy from the wicked Benedict IX in order to rid the church of a very bad pope. And he becomes his right-hand man. And so Gregory takes him to Germany, and and eventually he's going to return with the guy who becomes Benedict the Tenth, not Benedict the Ninth, but Benedict the Tenth, and that's where Hildebrand's really going to assume the reins of power. So when he's in Germany, he becomes aware of how bad things are amongst the priesthood, and that's what makes him even more committed to the Cluny reforms, and also where he locates the man who is going to become Leo the Tenth. So he's instrumental in this happening, and also that's what leads to him to being there to affect the rise of Nicholas II.